human states are viral in nature. In the PBS series This Emotional Life, where an accidental study was done about emotions, it's one of the bizarre aspects of our culture that the single motivation for all human action, human feeling, is almost completely ignored as a science in education. And so some of the greatest insights come from accidental studies where other things were being studied and then they go back after the fact. They learned a not surprising fact, which is that emotions are viral in nature. That if someone is depressed, the person next to them is more likely to be depressed than if someone is happy. That if someone is joyful, the person next to them is more likely to be joyful. All you have to do is understand mirror neurons and observe yourself in a social dynamic. And there is an incredible infectious component to all social interactions. If you find a crowd doing something, you are far more likely to find an individual in the crowd doing that same thing, even if it's very atypical. If you have a bunch of people smiling, the odds of you smiling back go up. So trauma, like anything else, is viral in nature. And the intensity of the virus is in part linked with the degree of its contagion. Now, there are a number of reasons, both selfless and selfish, why a culture wants to intercept trauma as it is erupting and blooming into PTSD and cascading down the disastrous slope of an individual's life and then rippling out. Because as this snowball builds momentum, the impact that it has on others in its wake is increasingly large as well. And I want to talk about some of the various ways that trauma can grow into a tailspin, into something that's harder and harder to get out of. It's been noted that in my area, 42% of our homeless people have PTSD. And that being homeless takes an average of 30 years off of a person's life. So you could say that 30% of a person's life is consumed with being homeless, and meaning is evaporated, is destroyed as a result of being homeless. And it's kind of a mixed bag, because there's usually a series of traumatic events that lead to being on the street. Being on the street usually leads to developing some form of PTSD. Having PTSD makes it almost impossible to get off the street, particularly when there's no low-cost housing alternatives available. And so we have a dynamic where there's kind of like digging a deeper and deeper pit. And in the case of homelessness where I live, it costs somewhere between $40,000 and $200,000 a year to maintain chronic homelessness of taxpayer money. And that's paid in emergency medical bills. It's paid in policing to shunt people from one area to another with nowhere to go. It's paid in higher crime rates. They don't even count the lower real estate value rates, the fact that nobody really enjoys buying a house in a community that doesn't know how to take care of its people. And so there's a chronic cost there. In my own life, the therapeutic abuse that led to trauma led me to reach out to the therapists who had recommended my abuser. And they denied and participated in a cover-up, which led to PTSD. Now, when a therapist and the representing or recommending therapists all collude to act illegally in the interest of the abuser, and the therapists are simultaneously the primary source of support, you lose multiple things. First of all, you've got the trauma of the therapist. Then you've got the PTSD around the cover-up. Then you've got no therapist to go to. And you've got no trust in therapists because if therapists are that unethical, meaning 4 of the therapists that colluded in the cover-up had been my personal therapists, some just a session or 2, others more extensively, and you realize that therapists don't understand their primary ethics. At least my therapists don't. But that's the thing. This destroys confidence. This destroys trust. Not only in therapists, but in self. And so we've got a bigger problem. Because the first problem comes with the trauma. The second problem comes with PTSD. The third problem comes with trust in therapists, because where are you going to go for help? The fourth problem comes with the trust in self, because I chose those 4 therapists. I chose them and I trusted them, which means that part of the problem lies within. That's a pretty high strikeout rate for those 4 therapists to strike out. And so then the question becomes, well, if I was wrong about them, who else am I wrong about? If I pick someone else, then am I going to be wrong there as well? And the answer is I don't know, because I didn't think I was wrong about them. And so you have, now a deeper crisis compounding, these other things. Now the PTSD, of course, knocks me off my feet physically to where it's literally hard to get off the floor for a couple of months. Well, this collapses income. It not only collapses income, but in making me become more incompetent, it then escalates anger from people who are relying on me to be competent. In a trauma-illiterate culture, I don't say I've got PTSD with sexual abuse and I have empathic, friendly people saying how I can help. I have, excuses, come on, when are you going to get this done? And the answer is I don't know, which breeds then into a future of, I don't know, so the emotional crisis then becomes a financial crisis, which then becomes a new emotional crisis, which becomes, then am I going to be punished for the rest of my life for the fallout of this, and how long will it last? There again, I don't know. Well, I need to be able to depend and trust on myself, but I've just learned that I'm not trustworthy to pick people who know what they're doing. So there's these endless ripple effects. And so health problems cost more money at the same time that money is being reduced, which escalates fear, which makes it harder to recover from PTSD. And there's so many of these spirals when we look closely at our patterns of abuse and repair in our culture. Whether it's the child who is first abused, but particularly in egregious cases of, for example, sexual abuse, having first abused the child, the parent is now afraid of the child. So first they lost the message that they were valuable and that their boundaries and things mattered. Now they're getting the message that they're the scary one because their parent is afraid of them. And in fear, the parent is now colluding to undermine their reputation, or the minister at your church is now colluding to undermine the reputation of the child that's been violated to protect the minister, to protect the priest, in a way that superior force, superior mass is targeting smaller mass, a child, an individual from a group, etc., with a sociopathic agenda that does not put that person's well-being first. There's also then the manipulation towards insanity. This never happened. If it did, it's no big deal. If you think it's a big deal, there's something wrong with you. And all of that message that says, well, maybe I am crazy. And there's a great incentive to agree, you're right. I shouldn't be making a big deal that my priest molested me or whatever because, well, it's only a priest, who's the will of God and all that. And then you start to go crazy. In order to avoid being attacked, you kind of submit to the story, the narrative that is being told by the abuser, which is a further betrayal. So first you're asked to be abused, then you're asked to be treated like an enemy, then you're asked to be told that you're insane and to be undermined. And these forces keep building. And because the underlying message is you don't matter, you're not valuable, my needs are more important than yours, in the submitting to superior force in order to accommodate the abuser so they won't keep punishing you, there is a buying into this virus, this thought, this belief that I don't matter, I'm not valuable. Now this is the most damaging aspect of all, because if you come away knowing by tacit acceptance of the behavior that you are not valuable and you don't matter, you have no reason to repair the abuse, to fight for anything beautiful and good. You have no reason to recover because you don't matter and you're not valuable. If instead you fight for your value, you're also fighting for your truth, but your truth exposes the abuser, so you remain the enemy. And so there's this incredible conflict of energy, of power and health. I can dominate you. I can make your life miserable. It's you that's breaking your mother's heart. It's not me who's betraying my wife. It's you that are ruining our lives. It's not us that could be being more mature adults as opposed to children in a grown-up's body. These types of things are piled one after another, often creating the sense of overwhelm that leads to age regression if you're not young already. Well, when you've got 5 or 6 layers of abuse all on one another and a culture that minimizes and denies it, and you need to spend more money on therapy at the very moment you're making less in income and scared about the future, it's very difficult to leave the vortice, that's spinning and spinning and spinning, and come back to presence, to come back to truth, to come back to self, to come back to who we are. And that is the biggest challenge, to still and come back, to trust that at the core of who we are, there is something beautiful and innocent that cannot be taken away by anyone. It can be covered over, it can be bullied, it can be buried, but it cannot be taken away. That core is there. And it's, of course, harder and harder to find the core when, as we become still and go in, what we're met with is an excruciating screech of grief and pain and sorrow and loss at the divergence from our optimal future, at the divergence between where we were going and who we wanted to be and where we're ending up as we're carried off track in this snowball effect. There's enormous pain, there's enormous grief. And yet there is help. There is help at some point when we're able to face and tolerate the pain, the grief, and go back into that core. The truth of who we are, the beauty, the truth, the goodness of who we are remains. What I want to acknowledge and what I think is valuable to write down is the fear of the snowball effect, and the fact that the longer a trauma cycle goes unsupported, undiagnosed, unrepresented, untreated, the bigger it gets. And the bigger it gets, the more it ripples out into others. For example, if I had collapsed financially, the first person would have had a problem was my landlord. Then, what if he's having a trauma or difficulty at a similar time and that topples him over? And if I can't run my company, then my employees start having a problem. And did. Their work went down because of the trauma, etc. The quality of work went down because of the lack of supervision. So everyone is suffering. My clients are suffering. My employees are suffering. If it had continued, to that extent, my landlord might have suffered. But it is in everyone's interest when there is a very small trauma to intervene and do the right thing, to avoid the necessity of splitting the self, because this is also part of what becomes so difficult. When we have an unethical force that is asking an individual to choose between their own truth and protecting their abuser simply to avoid repeated bullying and trauma, you now have a dynamic where you've split the self, because one part wants to tell the truth and the other part wants to avoid further abuse. Well, the more you divide the self, the weaker you become. The weaker you become, the less you can interrupt a snowball effect and take a strong anchor for your truth. So I have great compassion for the snowball effects that we have created as kind of de facto defaults in our culture, where if this starts happening in any number of situations, no one's going to stop it. So this is going to start happening. And once that starts happening, no one's going to stop that. And everyone's saying this isn't my problem. And yet as the snowball gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, it eventually crashes into other people's lives and creates enormous problems. But we don't yet have the sophistication, the vision, the character, and the self-love as a cult, as a culture, to understand these trajectories and have it just be an automatic thing, that if anyone is experiencing an explosion of trauma in our neighborhood, in our city, that we know about it within minutes, that we have the background in trauma, etc., to respond, and we consider it an honor, an act of dignity, an act of humanity, an act of self-love and cultural preservation, to enclose that trauma, to hold it with respect, with care, with the science of repair, to a point where that trauma dissolves, the person comes back into their body, PTSD doesn't erupt, they're shepherded through the crisis and return as functional members of a productive, growing, and loving culture.